Welcome to Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2021, Relationships and Healing. This webinar is part of Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2021, Relationships and Healing. It is a collaboration between Law Society Pro Bono Services, the 5 Community Development Councils, National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, Singapore University of Social Sciences School of Law, Singapore Management University School of Law, and the Singapore Corporate Counsel Association, supported by the People's Association. I'm Serene, and I'm your host for this webinar. Today's webinar is Fighting in Court or Building Bridges. First, some housekeeping matters. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type your question in the Q&A function. We will do our best to address your questions during or at the end of the webinar. Please note that today's discussion is not intended to substitute any form of professional legal advice. If you require specific legal advice, please consult a lawyer. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar, Mr. Tan Lam Siong and Ms. Lim Lei Ting. Lam Siong is a mediator at the Community Mediation Center and is a senior legal practitioner. He is a very seasoned mediator and has mediated a diverse range of cases from complex corporate disputes to communal and family disputes. He was recognized for his extensive volunteer work by the state courts in 2019 with the Outstanding Volunteer Award. Lei Ting is a partner at Allen & Gladhill and was an associate professor at NUS Law School for 12 years. She is also a mediator, having been a principal mediator with the Singapore Mediation Center since 1997. However, she is here today as an advocate and a lawyer who has encouraged clients to go for mediation and has assisted clients in achieving a good outcome at mediation. Lam Siong and Lei Ting, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Nice to be here.
So Lei Ting, could you share with us on what are the different ways that people can try to resolve disputes in Singapore?
Well, not just in Singapore, but elsewhere. When we come across disputes, many of us tend to be conflict avoiders. So unless it's a big thing, we would tend to walk away. But if it's something that really bothers us, there's a whole range of things that you can do. Anything from negotiating with a person to the other end of the scale, going to court and suing that person. But somewhere in between, you can also have, speak to someone who might have some level of influence on the person, or bring in a third party who might be a neutral mediator to help you to talk to each other. So there's a very, very wide range of different ways of resolving disputes.
Thanks, Lei Ting. So I think maybe most people are familiar, with going to court or mediation. So what's the difference between the two mechanisms?
The big difference is that is the role of the third party. So when you go to court, the third party is a judge, and that judge makes a decision based on law. And the law can come from either legislation or case law. And when you go to court and the decision is made based on law, sometimes it might be a somewhat complex basis for that decision. And generally, it wouldn't be something that's within your control, because what you need to do when you go to court is you persuade the judge that your position is right. When you're actually mediating, there's a whole different thing. Mediation is really where a third party, who's a neutral, is there to try and help you to come to an agreement between the two of you, or if there's more than two people, amongst all of you. The role of a mediator is not to make a decision. The role of a mediator is not to preach. In fact, the role of a mediator is to actually help the parties to engage in a useful, constructive conversation so that they can actually see whether an agreement is entirely possible.
Thanks, Lei Ting. Speaking of mediation, Lam Siong, could you share about what is Community Mediation Center and what's the role it plays in the community?
Let me begin by telling a story. Once upon a time, there were villages in Singapore, right? And in every village, there will be a village chief. And what he does is, if there are problems, people will go to him, and he will try and exercise his influence, his authority, and then resolve the disputes for the people living in his village. And these villages soon became cities, and then you have courts, and people no longer go to see this village chief anymore because he's now obsolete. So you have courts and you have judges and you have laws. So people go to lawyers and they seek lawyers' counsel, and then they proceed to court to resolve the disputes. And that was the way of life for city dwellers. And then in 1998, CMC was formed, and that's the Community Mediation Center. It's a throwback to those days where you had somebody whom you could approach, sit down with the other party and try and talk things out and find a resolution. So you can say CMC actually plays that role of trying to help parties, especially in a communal dispute, to come to some form of agreement, to be able to carry on living harmoniously in the same vicinity without having this issue disrupt their lives time and again. So the Singapore our Community Mediation Center, CMC, what it does is to provide a very safe environment for people to come and talk to each other under the purview of a very well-trained person known as the mediator, who is there to help to moderate the dialogue between the parties and help them explore possible solutions and to move forward in their lives. And that engenders a greater harmony in, of course, the environment where they lived in, and that's good for everybody. And in the end, everybody saves money, and of course, lawyers are deprived of their income.
Thanks, Lam Siong. So, actually, what kind of disputes does Community Mediation Center deal with?
Okay, so I was mentioning communal disputes. So communal disputes can be between two neighbors, it can be within the family, it can be between friends, it can be between co-workers. So these are the kind of disputes that CMC would assist in mediating.
All right, thanks Lam Siong. So let's see how this is applied in real life by walking through the next case scenarios dealing with family, community, and employment. So our first scenario deals with family. Mr. Tan is a widower who fell and fractured his hip. He lives alone in Singapore in his fully owned paid HDB flat. He needs full-time care, either with a maid at home or in a care facility. He has 3 children. Jane visits him 2 to 3 times a week, lives on her own, and has a meager income as a cleaner. Mark has never visited Mr. Tan. He's a professional, has 2 children, and lives in private property. Rachel lives in London with her 2 children and husband. Jane wants Mark and Rachel to help pay for Mr. Tan's expenses. Mark says that Mr. Tan has always been biased and abusive towards him and that he owes Mr. Tan nothing. He thinks Rachel should pay because Mr. Tan spent all of his money on Rachel's overseas education. Rachel refuses to answer any texts or emails. So Lei Ting, from a legal perspective, what could Jane do in this situation? Sorry, Lei Ting, I think you might be on mute.
Is it better now?
Yes, you can hear you.
Okay.
Thanks, Lei Ting.
Playing with my things too much. So this is not a community dispute, it's a family dispute. And unfortunately, this is not unusual. And this is a matter that in Singapore would actually be brought to the Tribunal for the Maintenance of Parents if Jane wants to do so. there really isn't an obligation at law other than under the Maintenance of Parents Act to maintain one's parents, right? Unlike maintenance of children or spouses in a family. So it's only because we have this Maintenance of Parents Act that someone who is over 60 or has some permanent disability and is unable to look after themselves, that they can go after their own children to get them to be to help with maintenance. Or in this situation, Jane can actually be the representative of Mr. Tan, with his permission, of course, to then bring an action against her siblings in the Tribunal for the Maintenance of Parents. Now, the Tribunal for Maintenance of Parents is unlike a court in that lawyers are not allowed. And the general principle there is to look at family responsibilities, look at filial piety, look at the fairness in terms of the burdens of looking after old people. But the way that the tribunal is set up is that at the very first instance when a case is brought up, it would go to the Commissioner for Maintenance of Parents, and the Commissioner's staff are actually trained in mediation. I think I ran some of those trainings. And they would do mediation with them first. In some instances, if the mediation doesn't come to an agreement, it would actually be referred to a panel of mediators. And if after that they still can't come to agreement, then they would go before the tribunal. If they can come to agreement before the mediators, then that agreement actually can become a court order, an order that is actually issued by consent of the parties by the tribunal itself.
Thanks, Lei Ting. You know, when you speak of mediator, and I think you mentioned the mediator doesn't make a decision. So does it mean that so what happens if parties just can't come to an agreement?
Well, you see, the thing about mediation is that, of course, our goal is to try and get parties to seek resolution. Sometimes resolution is not about agreement, because sometimes resolution is about understanding each other's perspectives, understanding the constraints that people may have, or in some instances, just actually understanding the person across the table and figuring out for yourself whether it's really worth fighting, you know, depending on, you know, personalities, depending on what's at stake, depending on what you really need to fight for, right? So for us as mediators, probably the most important thing about the mediation is actually not the resolution, it's actually getting the parties to communicate with each other across the table. And I mean, as you can imagine, mediations can actually be very emotional, negative emotions most of the time, but as mediators, we're all trained to handle it. Right, Lam Siang?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Lei Ting has said. You know, sometimes it's not so much about the resolution, it's a process of allowing people to engage each other and then allow the communication to basically allow the communication to bring the parties closer to one another. They may not resolve the problem at the end of the day, but at least they are able to see things in the better perspective without being too idealistic about what they expect the other party to do. And I think the wonderful thing about mediation is that it actually allows people to speak about their most innermost feelings. Whether you like it or not, it exists. There's no right or wrong about the way a person feels, because that's something that the person's makeup generates in him or her. So yes, I totally agree with what Lei Ting has said. So resolution may be good for people to move on, but sometimes even without the resolution, people can start talking after the process has ended, and they may even come up with their own resolution somehow in a very natural way.
Thanks, Lam Siong. And it sounds like it might be useful in this situation, because in this case now you can tell there's a lot of underlying feelings, perhaps from childhood. You know, they feel there's certain resentment. So as you said, maybe the mediation is that platform that, you know, to allow them to basically express what they think or feel. I think one interesting question is, does it matter that Rachel's based overseas?
Nowadays with Zoom, not really, but she has to be willing to participate. So as a mediator, not at the tribunal, but as a mediator in Singapore Mediation Center, and in other mediations, I've actually done them by Zoom. It's a little bit more difficult than having people face to face in a room. You can't, move around, change positions and all that. But you can still get people to talk to each other. The only problem here is that if Rachel refuses to answer any texts or emails, you might not actually be able to get hold of her at all. But that does not mean that this is not a situation where Jane and Mark can actually have a conversation with a third-party mediator, just so that they understand each other better. It's not always a happy ending, but I can say that in all my years of mediation, there have been enough happy endings to make me actually believe that mediation is always worth a try.
Thanks, Lei Ting. Let's move on to our next scenario that deals with neighbours. To our audience members, if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A function. And we'll also try to take them during the course of the discussion of the case scenarios. So our second case scenario deals with neighbours. Fiona has been working from home since DORSCON Orange. Her office had made this a permanent arrangement. She has allergies and cannot use air conditioning. She lives alone. Cigarette smoke and ash from her next-door neighbour has been coming into her flat. Her unit smells of smoke and is dirtied by the ash. She is not sure which of her neighbour's family member is the heavy smoker. She knows very little about the family next door and is afraid to find out. Well, Lei Ting, what are Fiona's legal rights in this situation?
Unfortunately, this happens more often than it should. But and I actually just literally saw somebody's post about a Mothership article about somebody who switched off somebody else's electricity. So yes, this does happen. Okay. Okay. What are her legal rights? Now, in Singapore, we have something called the Community Dispute Resolution Act, and it is an act that has actually given those of us who own property to actually take out an action against somebody who is interfering, a neighbor who's interfering with our enjoyment of that property. So this would actually be an application under the Community Disputes Resolution Tribunal. Of course, it will always first go to the CMC, and so Lam Siong would see these kinds of cases. And if at CMC they can't arrive at a mediated agreement, then they may actually go on to court. Even in court, in the CJTD, the Community Justice and Tribunals Division, it's primarily based on the idea of getting parties to understand what's going on. So it's really not about, a judge telling people what to do, but of course the judge has the authority to do so. Under the CDRA, a judge actually has quite strong powers to do many things. A judge can actually grant orders that actually require people to behave in a certain way in their home. And if that behavior is in breach of a court order, it can actually get to the point where someone can actually be deprived of the right to live in that property. And if I'm not wrong, a few years ago, that actually happened in one case. It really has to be very, very serious, because the whole framework of the CDRA and the whole scheme behind community dispute resolution is about recognizing that in Singapore, we all live in very close quarters, we live close to each other. We kind of have to understand what is needed to be able to live together more or less harmoniously. So it's not something where, the judge will tell people to do things that are unreasonable. So that would actually be Fiona's option, to take an application against the neighbor. Now, the problem here is that if she doesn't know who exactly it is, right, then she can't actually start the action against that person, because you need to have a name, right? So she needs to find out who owns the property, or who is the lessee if it's HDB property. And that's something that can be found out with the search. Actually, nowadays you can search for names of people on leases and property. She doesn't have to know the exact person who's actually doing the smoking, because the CDRA is in relation to people who have control over that property, right? So if I live in my property and it's my children who are being a nuisance, you don't sue my children, you sue me, right? Because then as the owner of the property, then you're actually asking me to do what I can to control my children. So that's what she can do.
Thanks. I think that's very good practical advice, because sometimes, especially in a neighbor situation, unlike the family dispute whom you know the name of your parents or your siblings, but you may not actually know the legal names of your neighbors, or especially if your neighbors being very uncooperative, the last thing they want to do is to tell you their legal name, right? I'm just curious. So, in order to start an action under this, what kind of details do you need besides the name? Do you need to know IC numbers, or it's fine just to know the name and the address?
Well, it would be best to have the IC number. If you really can't get hold of it, then because of privacy and all that, then the person's proper name and definitely the person's full address. Yeah.
Thanks, Lei Ting. I think you touched briefly that there are certain remedies that Fiona could avail herself of. I think for most people, they tend to think of money, right? I mean, when we read newspapers, it's always when people are sued, they tend to pay damages. But in Fiona's situation, I think she just wants him to stop. So, are there remedies to make people stop doing things?
Yes. No, so the whole idea of the Community Dispute Resolution Act is that you're not suing people for money, right? I mean, there's no question of you pay me money, I breathe in your smoke. So that's not what the whole purpose of the CDRA is.
Yes.
The CDRA is really about getting people to sort of understand the consequences of their actions. And then the orders that can be made would be, for example, things like, if we talk about, say, joss sticks, right? Or, religious offerings and things like that, then it would be actually coming to an agreement about how much and when and what time frame, that kind of thing. So it would actually be remedies that are very practical, right? And definitely not a situation where Fiona can say, please stop him smoking forever, because you can't do that. There's such a thing as personal liberty.
Thanks, Lei Ting. So I think it sounds like it is possible. It's not just about money, but it might be possible to ask the judge to stop or reach some sort of compromise. And I think, you just did highlight that you also can't be unreasonable and just say you have to stop smoking forever. So I suppose for anyone who is facing such a situation is to really think about what's really a reasonable remedy or solution that you're trying to look for or think for. So Lam Seong, I think one question we had from the audience members is that, you don't want to accidentally trigger your neighbor by asking him, hey, let's go for mediation, because you're afraid he'll retaliate more, smoke even more. So do you have any tips on how you might approach the neighbor in a friendly way so that the neighbor doesn't retaliate?
Well, this is something which I think a lot of people struggle with. How do you approach your neighbor? Especially when he has been smoking and you've been tolerating for a while and you've been suffering in silence, right? I would say there are probably 3 don'ts that you should observe if you are going to approach your neighbor. One is don't confront your neighbor, all right? Don't confront him, meaning to say, don't go there, you don't bang his door, and then shout at him and say, what's happening? Don't you know that, you are causing my family to suffer inhalation of secondhand smoke? Don't you know how toxic that is? So when you start with confrontation, that's going to be bad. The next thing I'll say is, don't call the police. Don't call the town council and don't call HDB. Many times when we see people coming for mediation, there has already been a long history of police reports, town council involvement, and HDB officers visiting the neighbor. And it's become so bad that they are all angry and the emotions are high. But the strange thing is, at the end of the mediation, the problem is resolved because they talked and they found a way to accommodate each other. So I always say this, that if talking helps you to find a way out of your predicament, why do you want to go call the police and then make matters worse for yourself? And this comes to my last don't, the third don't. Don't complicate matters. Sometimes you retaliate. Your neighbor is smoking, you have your wet laundry dripping into his. It's bad. I think when you start this tick and tack kind of strategy, you miss the whole picture, right? And things just snowball and become an avalanche, and it's going to be even harder for you to approach your neighbor. So when you approach your neighbor, think of positive communication, all right? In other words, avoid using negative tones, negative emotions, negative language, and negative body language, all right? First, don't make accusations. Don't go down there that you Do you know you are the one smoking and it's been floating into my house for a long time? I'm almost dying. My children are coughing. Don't make accusations. Don't make insults. This is the second point. Don't insult the person. You got nothing better to do, is it? Don't say such things. And 3, don't use abusive language or vulgarities. It's not going to help you anywhere. So if you put yourself into the shoes of the person that is at the receiving end, ask yourself, would you be able to listen to what the person is telling you? Would you be able to accept his presence in front of you? Would you like to see his face again? No.
It sounds like what you're saying is that maybe for mediation, maybe it's a question of timing, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, because on what you say is don't let it escalate too far, you know, to the extent that you're having a huge warfare there and the police is involved, the town council is involved. So it sounds like what you're suggesting as well is that mediation, you shouldn't wait until it's like the last, you know, step or measure. You know, maybe it's something to think about whether you take this step earlier, as you said. So I'm just curious, what do you think is a good time, you know?
Well, in terms of trying to shorten the pain and agony that you're suffering, the earlier you do it, the better it is. Of course, the timing is such that if you feel at the point in time that the point in time has come where the parties are unable to move any further in their communication and there is a stone wall, then by all means, go for mediation. And how do you approach your neighbor depends on how nice you're going to be about the topic of mediation. When I say nice, I'm using an acronym. Nice as in N stands for being neighborly. How would you talk to your neighbor when you see him in the lift, right? And investigative. Go and find out first whether you are picking on the right person. It may be difficult. It may be difficult, but you need to do some homework. Right? You need to do some homework. And then be conciliatory also when you approach a neighbor. All right? I think if this problem is going to persist and we're not able to find a solution, do you think that maybe both of us should go and seek help from CMC and then let the third party help us look into this? All right? And then, of course, the last part of it is try to be engaging. May I come and see you again if this problem persists? Do you mind if I come and talk to you again? So when you're nice about it, I think people like nice people, right? Generally speaking. So you will be able to get things to move in a more effective way, right? So these things about making police reports, try not to do that because it is antagonistic. And when you start doing that, you can remember those days when we were school kids? And this kid in the class always run to the teacher and complain. This person, that person has been bullying me. And what does everybody in the class say? Cry baby, teacher's pet. And then you get more of it. Right? So you use that psychology of trying to be approachable and be accessible to discussion. And I think you can probably break the ice. And there's no reason why the person will refuse to go and mediate with you. But having said so, there are hardcore smokers, all right? People who die will not want to go and do anything about it simply because they have their own reasons why they wouldn't do it. Could be they're hardcore smokers. There's no way they can stop smoking. And when you look at that, you can understand.
So, touching on, sorry, Ting. Yes.
Yeah, I want to say it's a scale, it's an escalating scale of what you do, okay? So, when you first encounter it, you get irritated, then you moan and groan to your children, your spouse, right? And then you sort of, what do I do? So I think the thing to remember is that we're all human beings. When we get home after a long day, we're very tired and we just cannot smile at a neighbor who just smoked and made me cough, right? So the thing to remember is that when you feel yourself getting upset, right, don't go and confront your neighbor at that point in time, right? But sometimes you have no choice because the neighbor is the one that comes to confront you. Then you back, right? So it's okay because we're all human beings. We can get over it. The general point is this: think about it as escalation. Don't straight away go to police. Try and figure it out first. There's residents committee, there's other neighbors. Maybe in the neighborhood, there's some auntie who can talk to everybody, or some uncle who can talk to everybody. Try all these different things. Think about it like, if you had a problem with someone in your family that you really wanted to deal with, who would you speak to that has some kind of influence before you go to the, the one that actually has the power and the money to say, stop it, otherwise you get no money from my inheritance or whatever, right? So think about it as escalating. And I would say, in answer to your original question, Serene, I actually think that there's never a time when it is too late to mediate. I have mediated cases involving, like, if there's already a court case, there's a decision, it goes to the Court of Appeal, and we can still mediate. It can be done.
Thanks, Lei Ting. Lam Siong, touching on the CMC, do you know what's the process like and how much does it cost?
Well, CMC is the cheapest mediation agency you can find in Singapore. All right, it's only $5.
Wow, okay.
Pay $5 and you can have any number of mediations, and you can even have a remediation within 3 months from your last mediation. All right, and they afford you, they provide you with very cool, nice environment for you to sit down with your neighbor in the privacy of your room that's soundproof in the sense. Everything that's discussed in the mediation room is considered private and confidential, and it can't be, whatever is said can't be used for purposes of litigation.
Actually, given what an important role the mediator plays, can you choose the mediator or is it assigned to you?
So the assignment is done by CMC, and usually the languages that the parties speak are taken into consideration when they assign the mediator. So, CMC will try to strike a balance when they appoint a suitable mediator for the parties.
Thanks, Lam Siong. Lei Ting, I guess the question is, now that, okay, parties already go for mediation, so what should you do to prepare? Do you need to gather evidence of people smoking, like photographs or something? Like, how do people prepare for mediation?
Okay, so this is me wearing my lawyer's hat. Huh?
Sure.
Now, as a lawyer, I would always advise my clients to actually reach agreement at mediation and settle it there, because then I don't have to charge you for going to trial, okay? So I would say prepare for mediation the same way you would prepare for a trial, in the sense that you get everything that you have ready, right? So if there are things that you want to show, if there are documents that you want to, pictures that you want to show, those are important. But the mindset has to be different. The mindset that you have in a mediation is, I want the mediator to understand my pain, right? And I want the mediator to understand the circumstances and what is going on. But stop the part where you're saying, I want the mediator to know that my neighbor is crazy and that my neighbor is so unreasonable and my neighbor is just horrible. There's no way that my neighbor can actually come to any kind of agreement with me. Because you must remember that in a mediation, the neighbor is also sitting there, okay? So then you're sort of bringing your argument in, right? For what, right? So it's more about actually telling the story from your perspective of how it has an effect on you and what you have tried to do to remedy the situation. So that at the end of it, you're basically telling the mediator and your neighbor, I've tried everything that I can. I hope something can come out of this meeting, right? So along those lines, when you gather your evidence and all that, just remember for mediation, it's not about making the neighbor look bad, because you can't come to agreement if your neighbor doesn't agree. So if you go to a mediation thinking that you want to prove that the neighbor is crazy, why would the neighbor agree to anything? Then you're actually asking the mediator to be some superpower that can actually make the neighbor feel good after you said all those terrible things, right? Having said that, you don't have to hold back also lah. So if you think that there are certain things that have to be said, fine. But in the mediation process also, you should know, there is also an opportunity for you to speak to the mediator alone, okay? Without the other side there. That is actually when you can bring up some of the things that might actually help the mediator to persuade the other side to come to some kind of agreement, right? Now, I was seeing in some of the comments, one popped out, maybe the person has a mental issue, okay? I have to tell you that very, very often when we deal with disputes, right? After we're so frustrated and all that, we always come to the conclusion, must have some mental problem, okay? I can tell you that's only right about 10% of the time, okay? Most of the time is because when you are actually encountering each other, you're only seeing that side of that person. And that's why mediation helps as well. Because in a mediation, just imagine with Lam Seong sitting in front of you, talking to you, why would people act mad and crazy? They wouldn't. But if you don't have the right mindset, if you're sitting thinking, oh, you Sila act like that, oh, you this acting only. But you see, you must understand, everybody has different facets. And if you are unhappy with that person, it might be because you've only seen the negative aspect of that person. So nobody is asking you to be Mother Teresa to see the beauty in everybody. But in a mediation, there is that opportunity to see something good in that person, something rational in that person, so that you can actually come to agreement and actually live together. I mean, you don't have to be buddy, always give each other cake and all that. That's not real for many people. But at least when you walk past each other in the corridor, you can actually then just carry on. I mean, life is like that, right? Yeah, so it's honestly being about realistic, right? So preparation is about thinking about the purpose of the mediation. It is the opportunity to speak to the other side in a calm way. And then when you really want to let go of all the negative things, do it in private with the mediator.
Thanks, Lei Ting. I think that's a
I'd just like to add to what Lei Ting has said, and this is from something that I recollected happened in one of the past mediations I did. And it's very true, how you present yourself in the mediation has an impact on how the other party will respond to you. If you are very negative about it, I think you probably won't be receiving any positive response. So in this particular mediation that I had, interestingly, the other party who has been accused of some form of harassment behavior was actually listening very intently to what his neighbor was talking about, how he was presenting himself. And I can tell you, in the joint session, I actually had this impression that that neighbor whom he was complaining about was doing things deliberately against this neighbor. And during the private session, and we have this private session where we are alone with one of the parties, and I asked him, can you tell me what's really happening? Were you picking on him? He says, yes, I was. I didn't like him when I first saw him. I thought he was a brute. I thought he was very uncivilized. But do you know, just now in the joint session when I saw him, I was very surprised. He sounded so educated, and I'm beginning to like him. Can you believe that is actually a real case? So it does happen. It does happen. So when you are going for mediation, remember the mindset is very different from one where you are engaging a person in court. Yeah.
Thanks, Lam Seong. I think one question we receive from the audience is, it sounds like mediation revolves around parties agreeing. What happens if one person doesn't agree to go to mediation? Can CMC compel that person to go for mediation?
The thing about mediation is that it is consensual. Everybody must agree. Nobody can be forced to attend a mediation. And if you have to force somebody, you can only take him to court. Right? He has no choice.
Yes.
Right? Because he's been sued. But for mediation, it is all voluntary. So yes, everybody's got to be persuaded to go for mediation. And if your neighbor is someone who is not convinced, when you approach CMC, they have very efficient, friendly staff who are able to speak to that neighbor of yours and try and convince them to come.
Yeah, for a while I was working in an office which was kind of next to where the CMC officers were. I can attest to that, Lam Seong. They've got very persuasive and actually very enthusiastic staff at CMC, and they just spend time persuading people to go for mediation. But I also want to say that while mediation at CMC is voluntary, if you don't go for CMC mediation and you go to the CDRA, that's a court proceeding already. So it's a court order that requires you to show up in court. Then actually the judge also tries to do mediation, but that's a different kind of mediation. When a judge is doing mediation, it's not something lovely and charming like Lam Seong. The judges are charming, but it's just a different thing, okay? It's just a whole different story.
Thanks, Lei Ting.
And I can share also further with you that CMC officers have actually made house visits in the past to find out why some people are not inclined to attend mediation sessions. And they actually found out that there is this general misconception that people actually think that face-to-face meetings are confrontational. They're very threatening, all right? But without realizing, of course, in the mediation, you've got this expert third party who is there to neutralize all the toxic toxicity in the atmosphere. And then they also have this misconception that these problems that they have with their neighbors should be fixed by the relevant authority, and that the neighbor should be taken to task by the authority. So it's not their problem. But we all know what the truth of the matter is. At the end of the day, they are the ones living the problem that they are talking about, and they need to do something at their end to try and bring that to a closure. So this kind of hands-off approach is not going to work unless, of course, your neighbor moves out for some reason.
That's a very important reminder in that this may be just one issue, but you're going to continue living with a neighbor for the next how many years that you're going to stay at that property. So you may not want to antagonize your neighbor too much because you will be seeing each other from time to time. So one question we have from the audience is, yes, okay, everybody can discuss, come to an agreement, but how do you make it legally binding? You know, is it just take him as his word for it?
So in the process of mediation, and when parties come and to some form of agreeable solution, they will be putting their signatures to a written agreement. And that agreement will contain terms and conditions which will first be explained to all the parties. Once they understand it, they are also told that this has a legal effect and they sign it. All right? And of course, if issues arise later on, they can always come back for remediation. And if it's very serious, like what Lei Ting was describing about CDRT process just now, they can always go to CDRT. But
Yeah.
see, when they go to CDRT, they still refer back to the past mediation results.
Yeah. So what has some of the cases I've come across would be where, and in fact, when you do the application for CDRT, there's actually a question of whether you've actually tried mediation before. So if there's a prior mediation agreement which has been breached, and I've come across quite a few of these cases, you would, if you're the applicant, you would actually put it into your application so that the judge knows what was previously agreed. And then when the judge actually gets the parties to talk to each other, the judge would actually review what happened as well. Sometimes agreements that people arrive at are not necessarily easy to follow, maybe because at that point in time they feel that they can, but the reality is that they can't. You know, I mean, you can't tell a smoker cut down to 1 pack a day if they're a 3 pack a day guy, right? But you know, in front of a mediator, in front of the other side who might be very charming, might say, yes, I will do it, but then they can't, right? So that can be taken into account. So enforceability of mediation agreements arrived at the CMC, not directly enforceable, but usually in mediation, what we rely on, and it actually happens, okay, is that because people are the ones who came together to reach the agreement, most of the time people actually meet it. It's about compliance. It's about, because they own it, you see, it's their solution. It's not something that somebody told them to do. So actually 85% of the time they would actually follow it. But when they don't follow it, then you go to CDRT and you go before a judge and the judge makes an order, then or the judge gets the parties to come to agreement, that agreement becomes an order of court. And if that order of court is breached, then there can be a special direction. There can even be a special direction with a bond. That means the court under the CDRA can actually require one of the parties to actually like sort of put money in to say, I will abide by it. If not, this amount of money will be forfeited. And then of course, the last one is that the person doesn't get to live in that place anymore.
Thanks, Lei Ting. We need to move on to our next scenario on employment. Valerie works as a gym instructor at ABC Gym. She does not have any written contract with ABC Gym. Due to shortage of gym instructors, Valerie was suddenly assigned to 50% more classes to teach. At the end of the month, Valerie discovers that ABC Gym did not pay her for the extra time that she spent on those classes. ABC refuses, saying that her pay is fixed. Lei Ting, what are your thoughts about Valerie's situation?
So if it is clear that Valerie is an employee, she can actually make an employment claim and go to TADEM, which is the Tripartite Alliance for Dispute Management, to make a claim for pay or short pay, right? And then what would happen in that situation is that TADEM would actually reach out to the employer and engage with the employer to get Valerie and the employer to actually negotiate and mediate the situation. Before COVID, these were face-to-face mediations. And then when COVID started, actually even before COVID started, they were working on sort of, online sessions where it would go by emails, right? So you can actually do a mediation by email as well, right? So in essence, what would happen is that there would be a mediation where Valerie and the employer and the mediator from TADEM would actually talk about the situation. And if they can come to an agreement, then that agreement actually can be signed and is enforceable. If they don't come to an agreement, or there's an offer that's made by the employer, but the employee does not want to accept, then that mediation comes to an end, and TADEM would issue something known as a claim referral certificate, which would then allow Valerie to actually start the case in the Employment Claims Tribunal. But I would say that generally in this kind of situation, when you enter into employment contracts, just make sure you know exactly what your terms are, and this is one of those situations where a lot of people in this sort of freelance gig economy, whatever, they don't really think about what the terms and conditions are. Law Society has run a number of different talks on how to protect yourself when you enter into an employment agreement. I strongly urge you all to look out for those talks. But in a situation like this, the first port of call is actually TADEM and mediation.
Thanks, Ting. I think it's a good pointer that sometimes prevention is better than a cure. So do, if you get offered a job, do get a written contract and be very clear in terms of your pay, your hours, things like this, to avoid this situation. So Leiting, when you mentioned about TADEM, is it expensive? Is this process started by the employee or?
Yeah, it started by the employee, and to my knowledge, I don't think there's any fee that has to be
okay.
paid. Yeah, not that I know of, right? Because TADEM offers a service. They're not a government-linked body, but yeah, I may be wrong, but I really don't think that there's a fee. Actually, a lot of foreign workers who don't get paid go to TADEM, so you can't expect them to pay a fee, right? So yeah, no, there's no fee for the registration.
Yeah, I've done TADEM cases also. I think there's no fee.
Okay, that's good to know. So Lam Seong, how do you think that mediation might help in this situation? Because it's a little bit awkward in that, especially if she still wants to continue working at the gym, right? You don't want to burn all bridges and she might still want the job, but it's just that she wants to be paid fairly. How do you think mediation might help?
Well, first I must qualify this by saying that such cases don't come to CMC. CMC doesn't handle employment disputes, and unless, of course, she has actually commenced legal action on an employment contract, breach of employment contract, the matter will never go for mediation unless the parties agree. And I think when she sues the employer and it goes to court, the court also has the CER where you will find that the parties will be encouraged directed to go for mediation first. And in mediation, of course, I think Leiting will probably be able to tell you that parties will be looking not so much into the legal rights and obligations. They're looking at interest-based issues, how best to resolve this without incurring more legal fees and prolonging the litigation in terms of time and cost. So yeah, litigation will benefit, especially the employee, all right? Because the employee will want the matter to be resolved as soon as possible in the most efficient, cost-efficient way. And of course, for the employer, sometimes it's because it has a reputation to keep. It doesn't want this to be out there in the open. They want to keep it private. They also want to be able to move on somehow so that the other employees are not demoralized by what's going on. So yes, there are benefits both ways when it comes to mediation over employment issues.
Thanks, Lam Seong. No, it's good you mentioned that that's interesting, because you have community mediation center, which I guess is a more formal setting. And then you earlier had mentioned about the informal setting, which is the village chief who comes in. So who knows? I mean, as you mentioned, maybe Valerie could informally ask someone to help mediate, and to deal with the situation, as opposed to going straight to court. Because I imagine for an employer, although Valerie is perfectly entitled to do it, but it may one impact is that it may impact the relationship between Valerie and her employer when they receive the lawsuit.
Yeah.
So our next situation, Valerie continues on, and she becomes pregnant, and ABC Gym terminates her. ABC Jim tells her that they are entitled to do so because she's a freelancer and is not entitled to maternity benefits. So I think this is a very interesting situation because nowadays I hear so much about the gig economy versus an employee, and sometimes the line seems so blur. Lei Ting, what are your thoughts about Valerie's situation?
I think it really boils down to whether she has any basis to say that she's actually an employee rather than a freelancer. So you really have to look at what the contract says, but you also need to look at the arrangements between them. But I would also say that a lot of employers are very, very smart about these kinds of things. And therefore, they would make arrangements such that the opportunities for them being considered employers would be limited. But you know, it's kind of hard to come up with the specific sort of framework of what would make her an employee versus not an employee. And actually, I was looking at some of the questions. Some of the questions that people are asking are specific legal questions, which I think we shouldn't answer here. You should actually go to the many, many free legal clinics that are being offered, especially through the CDCs, to ask those questions, because 20 minutes with a lawyer just to outline your case would actually help you to answer the question. So for Valerie, I can't say whether she's a freelancer or not, because I would have to look at the circumstances. But if, for example, they said things like, you know, you are exclusive to us, you cannot go and be a gym instructor anywhere else, you cannot do your own private classes. If you do private classes, we get a cut, right? So there are different things that can come into it. But at the end of the day, what is it? It is this, if the employer refuses to accept that Valerie is an employee and insists on not paying, the only thing that Valerie can do is go to the Employment Claims Tribunal, or find a lawyer friend to do it for free, or pay a lawyer to actually make the claim, right? And then you have to think about what amount she's actually owed, right? Because if she's owed maybe about 5,000 to 8,000, you go to a lawyer, a normal fee for something like this would be 5,000 to 8,000. What are you fighting for, right? And then you would think, I win, I can get money back from from the other side. No, you never get 100%. This is not the United States. You cannot get all your legal fees paid, right? So unfortunately, in these kinds of situations, the whole Employment Act scheme is all about making sure that you need to be an employee before you are protected, right? So if you are an employee, clearly she is actually entitled to maternity benefits. And if the company is found to have actually disentitled her from maternity benefits, they are actually in quite serious trouble, and they have to pay her back quite a bit. Yeah.
Thanks, Lei Ting. Touching on the point when you mentioned about cost, Lam Seong, I'm just curious, and this question came from an audience member. Given mediation and litigation, right? Of course, there's also arbitration, but let's just focus on mediation and litigation. What's the most cost, time, and effort efficient? Because Lei Ting mentioned a bit about litigation, there's legal costs involved, etc. So what are your thoughts, Lam Seong?
Well, if you ask me, I do both litigation and mediation. Between the two, of course, I would say mediation anytime is a lot more, is cheaper and more efficient. But of course, at the end of the day, if you are going to say, I definitely want this, okay? This is the amount that I want. I will not settle for less. Then I say, please go for litigation, because the mediator is not there to act as a judge for you. If you are not going to be, if you're not prepared to seek a range of options, not prepared to consider a range of options, and only stuck on one, right? You are basically asking the mediator to act like a judge and decide for you. Now, if you are the other party, would you give in to the demands of A when what he is asking for is something that he should be asking a judge to award him? But so without a battle, without a fight in court, would the other party agree? No, I don't think you would be able to get it through.
But yeah, as a mediator, surely you have gotten people to see that there are other ways of solving their problem, right?
Yeah, of course.
So even if people are very fixed in one thing, depending on whether they are open to considering, I think there's no harm in going for mediation. I would say that mediation is the cheaper solution all around, and also you don't lose anything by going for mediation.
Certainly, yeah. I agree entirely with what Lei Ting is saying. My point is, if you're one of those who will never waver at all, and you are really, really stuck on your position, and you can't be persuaded, and you say, no matter what you say, I'm not going to listen, all right? Then I
Come
think,
on, Lam Xiang, surely you can persuade someone like that.
oh yes, you have cases where people come with a fixed agenda.
Yes.
They are not there to resolve the matter. They are there to find out more about what you have in your bag, and they are not there for settlement purpose.
So that is someone who's going for mediation with an ulterior purpose. But I'm very sure in your mediation career, as I have in mine, you have met people initially. You're like, wow, why is this person here? Then you work at them. Then you realize, hey, there's a way in, and then you can come to agreement, right? So I always think, no harm trying, and also don't think about it as, wow, I tried mediation once, doesn't work, nonsense, okay? Because mediation is depending on so many things, your mental state at the time, how you feel, whether you're supported, the kind of case, the mediator, and things can change. So there was one question of, oh, can I choose my mediator? If you go to CMC, you cannot choose your mediator. If you go to the Singapore Mediation Center and you want to pay for it, you can choose your mediator, right? So it all depends on where you are. There are circumstances where you can pay for your mediator. But the final answer I have to your question, Serene, is this. In international business, people are using mediation. One of my very early mediations involved this Chinaman involving some case in some kind of property dispute in Cambodia, and we were mediating, and his lawyer was Indian, and we were using Mandarin, and then there was a retired judge mediating with me. We settled it in half a day. And at the end of it, the gentleman wanted to ask me to translate to everybody. And he essentially said, this is the case we've been fighting for the last 5 years. I'm so glad that mediation works because we settled it in half a day and I'm so happy. So, there's always hope and you can always try. And the way I see it is you don't lose anything going for mediation.
Thanks, Lei Ting. Okay, one question I have, I'm just very curious. You mentioned mediation by email. How does that work? Because I always imagine mediation being like 3 people around a table and they're discussing. So how does mediation by email work?
It doesn't work very well.
So that means they will just email each other back and forth their thoughts and responses.
Yeah. So what does happen? And I have done it once before involving a case where I actually did meet them face to face first, and then we carried on in the details by email. Basically, what you do in the emails is that you set out what it is that you want, but actually, based on the emails, there's nothing to stop the mediator from calling one side or calling the other side, right? So what happens in the email is that it is sort of the statement that they make to each other, but at least you know where they are coming from. And it doesn't stop the mediator from trying to sort of work on the person on each side to get them to see different ways of resolving the situation. But I would say that email mediation would not be for things involving relationships lah. So you cannot settle a dispute with your neighbor by email, I think. I don't think that works, right? But employment relationship, especially when they are no longer employer-employee, that can work. And those of you who do online shopping and Amazon and all that, they all have all these automated internet sort of settlement dispute mechanisms. Why? It's all there. So it can be done. And there can be sort of electronic mediation. Yeah.
Thank you, Lei Ting. We've reached the Q&A section, so let's consider some of the questions submitted by the audience. And as a reminder to our audience, you can still submit your questions through the questions button on your screen. So one question that came about, and I think, the neighbor disputes is perhaps something that most of us deal with, is what happens if during the mediation vulgarities or very offensive comments are made? So how does the mediator deal with that? How does the mediator stop that from escalating that, one party want to say, oh, you defame me and things like that? Any thoughts?
There are ground rules when we do mediation. Of course, everybody will be informed not to use abusive language and to speak only when it's their turn to do so. So in the midst of it, sometimes people do carry away, they become emotional. And of course, you've got to constantly remind them that it doesn't help to move things forward if they persist in this kind of behavior. So most of the time they will oblige and they know what to do after that.
Thanks. And maybe that's I think the important role of mediator, as opposed to two of them are talking to each other, it will just escalate and everybody gets very emotional. But as you said, you set up ground rules so that mediator as a neutral third party can step in and be like, okay, as you mentioned, you're not supposed to use vulgarities, everybody take time off, and then take water break or, bio break and then come back.
Take a break and then come back again.
Yes, yes.
I think the question probably comes from a sense of insecurity or fear. Because if you feel like your neighbor is a certain sort of person, you might feel afraid, or one of the questions had to do with harassment. So there might actually be some concern that, that the person is a bully, right? One thing that I can assure you of is that at CMC, because the mediations that take place live actually happens within the min-law offices, right? So I think measures are taken to make sure that things are reasonably safe, must go through security, that kind of thing, right? At Tribunal for Maintenance of Parents, because things get very emotional, there's always a security guard, very obviously, like his face is at the window, so people know. I have had situations where I've had to mediate like the apex and all that, right? And then they speak very loudly, and then in Hokkien and whatever, right? So when they speak very loudly, I say, you speak very loudly, I'm scared, can you slow down, right? So in many ways, as mediators, we want people to be real, because that's who they are, and that's how you actually get at a real agreement. But we are also there to manage them and to show the other party they can be managed, and their bark is worse than their bite. But of course, there are some instances where their bite is actually very bad. So, don't be afraid. I mean, if you are concerned before going for mediation, please express that to the CMC staff. They are very good at handling these kinds of situations. And if you're going to the CDRT, I have handled a few of these cases as well, where the complainant is somebody who feels very vulnerable, like this little old lady, I've had one or two. You can actually express it to the court staff, and the court staff will sort of make arrangements so that people feel safer.
Yeah. And just to tag on to that, because I think you earlier mentioned that lawyers are not allowed, but maybe sometimes because people, if they might be a bit scared, they need moral support. Can they bring in like family member, friend, or really they're by themselves and they need to like argue or discuss it themselves?
Lamsel and CMC?
Well, I think at CMC, because of the COVID restrictions, right, you can't have too many people in the room. Yeah, but generally speaking, I think as a principle of trying to accommodate as much as we can the request of the parties, we will allow their family members to be present if they are helpful. If they are helpful. If they are disruptive, I think the mediator will then have to take certain steps to prevent things from getting worse. But currently, because of COVID, we cannot accommodate that request.
Yeah. So exactly that. Please don't bring someone just because you think that they will speak better than you, right? Because that means that they are not actually speaking for you. But as a mediator, I have had many situations where I have found the person who is there to be very helpful, right? Of course, there have been instances where they have been disruptive, but you really have to explain why it's important. And let me put it this way, you don't actually need that person to be in the room. You can actually have the person waiting outside for you. Then if you need a break and you need to talk to that person, ask for it, right? Because moral support doesn't have to be in the room itself.
So it does happen when parties do, for instance, bring a spouse along and the spouse sits outside and then they will confer with one another. If there are certain terms that has been discussed and they need to sort of get the blessing from the other half, they can do that.
True.
Yeah.
So another question we have is, so this is interesting. So for this particular person, basically the neighbor from downstairs comes out and say, hey, you are the smoker. And basically the person who's asking this question is like, I'm actually not a smoker, because it's I suppose perhaps in the development there's many units and it's very hard to trace who is the smoker. So, that the neighbor downstairs is obviously very agitated and escalating things. Any advice on how to de-escalate things and be like, I'm actually not the one smoking, you got the wrong guy?
Well, it does happen when a party is asked to go for mediation. Is it, well, the noise doesn't come from my unit. We're not even at home at the time of the day. I'm not the one smoking. Nobody smokes in my family. So It's up to the other party to accept that on the face value. Really, I mean, it's not for the mediator to go and explore and find out, hey, are you lying? Is he telling the truth? Because we are not fact-finding agencies. So that's why I meant just now, when you need to be investigative, go and find out more. If you have any kind of recording of the smoke coming into your flat, and you know where it comes from, and then you have evidence of smoking taking place in your neighbor's unit, by all means you can present that. But we are not going to go into fact-finding. We are going to see what your neighbor has to say about it. And if he firmly refuses to admit, maybe we'll go into a private session, and then from there we try and discover more. So the private session I meant, I said just now, is where you're sitting down privately with one individual, and then you will talk about things that you are not prepared to say in the presence of the other party. So perhaps that will help to move things along.
Thanks.
Being accused, it's not just smoking, there's also noise. So some people will say, wow, you're banging buckets and all that, right? And then people are like, I'm not doing anything. I think the important thing to bear in mind in these kinds of situations is when the person comes to you and is confrontational, okay, obviously your reaction would be to want to defend yourself, and depending on how you defend yourself, you either fight back or you keep quiet and you don't say anything. There are actually ways in which you can de-escalate, and sometimes if people are very upset and you're very calm, it doesn't work, because they get more upset because there's no reaction, okay? So depending on the situation, I would say try and manage the situation rather than, not me, prove it, or whatever lah, okay? So just try and take a deep breath. This is what I teach people when we're doing conflict resolution. If someone is coming after you and you're feeling attacked, right? And assuming you have the presence of mind to calm yourself, right? Take a deep breath and count to 10, right? Don't even listen to the person, count to 10, but don't ignore that, okay? So I call that being a fly on the wall. Okay? That comes from something that I've learned. Sort of be there and get into a calm space, and then just come back and then listen to the person. And then when the person is done, okay, because most people, even volcanoes also finish erupting, right? Then you say, okay, what would you like to do about this, right? Something like that. So there are techniques that you can use when people are coming after you. So those of you who are in workplace situation, employment and all that, those are all techniques that you learn in an employment situation that you can apply at home. Yeah.
Thanks, Lei Ting.
So that's if you're the receiving end. Of course, if you are the aggressor, you have to basically manage your anger, manage your emotions. Don't go to a mediation to attack your neighbor. You're not there for a fight, remember? You're there to mediate. There's a world of difference between litigation and mediation. So in the context of today's topic, fighting in court or building bridges, I think mediation is there for you to build bridges. And when you build bridges, both parties can cross, all right? And things can work out in a more effective way than if you go to court where you are actually burning all the bridges. And things can get worse after that.
Thanks, Lam Siong. And as we discussed earlier, especially as a neighbor situation, you're going to be dealing with each other for a very long time. So one question we have on the audience member is, how many times can you go for mediation? So the interesting situation this audience member has faced is that maybe, for example, the person was making noise. So they go mediation, it was resolved well. Then neighbor went around smoking, causing a lot of nuisance again. Then they go mediation, and then something else happens again. So is there a limit to how many times you can go for mediation?
Lei Ting, you want to try that? You are a mediator yourself?
I would say that after some time, you will have to explore why there are so many issues, and you have to explore whether it is really that person. And I don't know whether it's like you might think that it's retaliation, or maybe it's you being oversensitive. So I would say that, and I hope that CMC does this. If you go back to the CMC, they should give you the same mediator, right? And they do that at the tribunal and other places that I go to where I mediate, because if it's a repeat case, you kind of want to see the people again because you've already established a relationship with them to really understand what's going on. So I would say that irrespective of what kind of organization it is, all of us who mediate are there to try and help people manage the situation, okay? But again, as a lawyer, I would say if it happens too often and there's too much of a repeat and it's not because you're oversensitive, then go to court. Okay. And when you go to court for the CDRA, you basically list all the things that the person has done, right? So that the judge can help you. Okay. And if the judge is actually looking at the situation, then the judge might be able to tell you, actually, you're oversensitive, like, can you stop it? It smells like curry once a week. What is wrong with you, right? I mean, they don't say it that way, but because if you actually look at the act, it actually says that the orders that are made to get people to sort of behave in a certain way have to be reasonable under the circumstances, And again, we live in a country where we have to be very close to each other, unless we're privileged enough to live in some big swanky mansion, right? So we always have to meet each other. And so all the orders all the orders that the court makes have to do with us living with each other, whether we're multiracial, multi-religious, eat different kinds of food that smell different, that smell in a different way. It's all about helping us to live and work together.
So perhaps some of the cases we will come back for remediation will be the noise cases, noise disturbances, because after the last mediation, he agreed to do this and still I'm hearing noises. So when they come back for remediation, what we mediators will do will be to ask them, so is it more serious than the last time or is it better? It's better, but they're still hearing noises. So we start from that approach. Sometimes it's a matter of trying to get them to really talk to one another about whether it's really louder or the party is just being more sensitive to noise. Some people are light sleepers. The slightest noise will wake them up. So we also have to be alive to that possibility that the complainant is a light sleeper and perhaps trying to find a way to perhaps manage the expectations of not just the complainant, but also that of the other party as well. So I don't think I have come across more than 2 mediations for the same issue. And if it does happen again and again, I think maybe they should go to CDRT.
Yes, because there's as you said, it's mediation is very much about consensus. So if there's an underlying root issue that is that can't really be addressed, then perhaps, as you said, it's better to consider CDRT. Another question we received from an audience member is, so this is interesting. So the next door neighbor and the audience member are both unhappy with another neighbor who smokes indiscriminately. So what happens when there's multi-parties? Do you do a joint mediation or must you apply separately?
I think they are individually impacted by so-called the smoking behavior of one particular neighbor. So there isn't what you call a class action in mediation, yeah. So it has to be individual. The way I see it, especially in the context of COVID, you can't have too many people sitting in the room mediating in one session. So the complaints also will arise from individual circumstances, right? And how do you resolve the parties' issues if they require, for instance, this party to move into one particular location to smoke, and if the smoke actually drifts to one particular direction and involves the other neighbor who's also complaining about the smoke. So I think in cases like this, it will take the parties to actually separate their claims against the neighbor. I don't know whether Lei Ting agrees with me.
Well, I think there are a few considerations. I think if you both gang up together, that's how the guy will feel. Then he will feel even more victimized, right? That, wow, both neighbors are coming after me. But I think in law for the CDRA, it's actually a separate application. But when you make the application, you can also say my other neighbor also made this application so that the judge knows and everything is heard at the same time, right? So I think there are a few considerations to be had, but if it's a mediation, I would actually want the mediation organization to actually tell me that this person has had more than one complaint, but I wouldn't want to mediate them separate together. Because again, it's that whole unequal balance of power.
I think it's the dynamics involved.
Yeah, so it's quite unequal. So I would want to do separately, but I want to know. So I don't think it makes sense for them to be mediated by 2 different mediators, right? Yeah, it should be the same mediator, but the mediator should know, and then it's separate. Yeah.
Thanks. There's a question on, we touched about enforcement of the CMC agreement. If someone breaches, after you mediate, there's an agreement, it's breached. Is the first stop to basically go back to CMC and say, hey, this guy's not following it, or it's really go straight to court?
Well, you can ask for remediation. And if this doesn't help you, I suppose you can explore CDRT, or you can go for litigation. But I think most people will probably consider proceeding to CDRT rather than to go to litigation in the court.
Thanks. An audience member was, I guess, inspired by both of you. And they said, they're just curious, how do you get appointed to be a mediator at CMC? Must you be a lawyer in order to be a mediator at CMC?
No, I think mediators come from all walks of life. They can be
one of the best mediators I know is not a lawyer.
Yeah.
He's absolutely one.
So you don't need to have legal knowledge because, like I said, you're not there to decide who's right and wrong. There's no law to consider. All right, it's your sense of good fair play that's more important.
So CMC runs training courses, but CMC mediators are picked from the grassroots. So I'm very sure that Lam Seong has been very active in grassroots.
Oh, no. I think that used to be the past practice.
Yeah. Okay.
So now
so
non-grassroots leaders as well.
Okay. So so CMC has been around since 1996 or 7-ish. And so for a very long time, CMC mediators were grassroots leaders and so on, and they run training programs. I don't think it's something you can sign up for, right? But there are mediation programs that you can sign up for to become mediators. So I sell koyok for people a bit. Singapore Mediation Centre runs training programs to accredit mediators. Singapore International Mediation Centre, but that's usually for lawyers. And then my friend runs an organization known as SAGE, which also runs mediation programs. And I think there are a few other organizations that actually run mediation training programs. But specifically to be a CMC mediator, you have to go through the CMC training.
Is there a minimum age requirement to be a CMC mediator?
There isn't, but of course you have to be an adult.
Of course.
Yeah, and I would encourage people who desire to become a CMC mediator to actually go through SMC for training and accreditation, because they are very structured in terms of their training program. And if you qualify, then later you can actually approach CMC to say you're interested to be one of their mediators. And CMC will, of course, interview you and see whether they will recruit you for their panel.
There are youth mediation trainings. So a young man that I know runs something called Peacemakers, and that goes to the schools, some schools, and they run training programs and a competition so that the kids kind of learn to mediate each other. And when I used to teach at NUS, we had 1 or 2 programs where I think many years ago, we actually went to boys' home to teach the kids there about mediation. Yeah, so there are quite a few opportunities around, just not always regular, Yeah.
And I like to add, you don't have to go through mediation training to become a mediator. You can also make use of the training you derive from mediation training to be skillful in managing your own problems and those of the people around you. Without being a mediator, I mean, you can still be able to deploy those skills in a very productive way.
Thanks, Lam Seong. You mentioned earlier about practicing NICE and ICE. And I guess the audience member is thinking that, do you think that if you have an issue with your neighbor, is the first stop to actually contact CMC?
If you have an issue with your neighbor, the first thing I will ask you to do is, I think amongst the webinar materials you have, is something from CMC, it's the 5-step focus approach, right? And it does tell you, first, fix it yourself constructively. That's the F part. So try to address the conflicts on your own in a constructive manner to help prevent deeper misunderstanding, and only call the police when your personal safety is compromised, right? Then the O part is be objective. When you overcome with anger, it may be difficult to separate the problem from the person, So I'm now reading from there. It says, refrain from using verbal attacks and address the issue objectively and with decency. The C part is communicate your concerns tactfully. So it's important to express yourself in a calm manner with reasons, avoid words that accuse or shift blame, and be wary of the tone of your voice. Then the U is understand the other person's viewpoint. Put yourself in the other person's shoes and help and be able to understand the other perspective. Listen to what they have to say, especially what is causing their anxiety or frustration. And the S part is suggest solutions. Instead of being stuck in a fault-finding loop, seek for solutions that will benefit both parties, provide alternatives, be open to compromise. That's focus, F-O-C-U-S. All right. And if all this doesn't work, then pick up the phone, call CMC, or log on to CMC's website and sign up for a mediation. Pay your $5 fee and CMC staff will take care of the rest.
Thanks, Lam Siong. I guess maybe this goes back to Lei Ting's point, about the escalation steps, right? Similarly, maybe mediation is not your first port of call. Go and try to talk to your neighbor first, right? And try and, as you said, follow that 5-step approach and see whether you can resolve it first before actually escalating to mediation. So perhaps it's many different steps before you reach there as well. All right, so I think we will have to bring our Q&A session to a close. And at the end of the webinar, a survey form will pop up on your screen for your completion. We appreciate your comments as it will be used to improve future webinars. There are many more webinars as part of Law Awareness Weeks at CDC 2021. Please scan the QR code or visit the website www.cdc.gov.sg/lawarenesweeks to find out more about the other webinars. Relationships are precious. Heal relationships with those around you. Important reminder of the night. We would like to express our gratitude to Lam Siong and Lei Ting for sharing your knowledge and experiences with us. With that, we would like to thank all of you for joining us today and have a great week ahead.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you one and all.
Bye.
Bye.